Search the media, the internet, social media using the word tactics. You will probably be flooded with videos or articles about how to maneuver, such as how to do a so-called room clearing using methods such as dynamic entry or techniques on how to shoot various targets. Some instructors might place various targets in various ways, record shooting them in sequence, and title the video as something to the effect of multiple threat tactics or what have you. However, those are about how to apply tactics. There is something critically lacking because none of the videos talk about what tactics actually is. How to open a specific door is a technique, not a tactic. Same applies to how to maneuver to enter a doorway. Dynamic entry is not a tactic, it is a procedure. Applying dynamic entry where it is not suitable, then dying at a doorstep does not become tactical for no other reason than you having learned it from a Tier 1 operator. Timing how fast you can shoot a target to your front and back as fast as you can while standing in one place has no relevance to real operation situations where you cannot simply turn and shoot whatever it is that was to your rear without assessing whether if shooting was justified or not. And there is no instructor in actual operations telling you there will be someone to shoot directly to your rear. Things like certain way to enter a doorway or certain way to move in a hallway or certain way to shoot are not tactics. Those are procedures or drills. However, that is nearly all what most people talk about when running channels about tactics. Some might whine at this, saying those are just semantics. Is it really? Can you define what tactics is then? It is important to make a distinction about what those people may call mere semantics. Without being able to define what tactics is, we cannot fully understand the foundation of why a certain method would or would not be suitable for a situation. I have seen and experienced things such as an organization teaching only one way to do certain things, then treating it like some divine, unquestionable method. Since the suitability of the method is not questioned or any question gets ignored, it leads to lack of situation assessment or analysis of whether if that method is suited for a situation. Such organization then conditions its members to handle a situation in a scripted manner rather than analytical manner to determine optimized course of action. Westerners laugh at Eastern martial arts kata forms, punching and kicking thin air. While I also believe such kata forms are somewhat silly, what is even more silly is that such kata is how majority of the organizations and training outfits treat tactics, regardless of East or West. Rather than approaching a tactical situation in an analytical manner, then deciding a best course of action that is based on the analysis, they try to force-fit their prescripted standard operational procedure in a manner of kata, regardless of its suitability to a situation. They measure their tactical proficiency by knowledge and proficiency of executing the kata that is separated from reality. So, to avoid this ridiculousness, we need to examine the foundation of what we are doing and why we are doing it. So, what is tactics? Tactics is a scientific and systematic methodology of controlling probability of outcome. Tactics have multiple factors. The first factor is objective. What is it that you are trying to achieve? If your objective is rescuing a hostage who you think would be executed soon in a room of otherwise unknown situation as fast as possible, and you do not particularly care if you live or die, then dynamic entry may be your choice. Although that may mean rushing in the room with little to no information, then find out what the situation is only after potentially being met by an opponent's gun muzzle. However, if your own survivability is also a factor in addition to rescuing the hostage and you want to balance those priorities, then you might choose a slower method that allows you to examine the situation inside that room more before committing to entry to that room. If there is no hostage involved and there is no other pressing need to enter the room, then you might choose not to enter the room at all. So tactics change according to the objective. Before going further, I want to define some terms that I may use in the future. One term I will use is operant. This simply means a person engaged in an operation. This word was chosen mostly because of lack of a better term. The subject person I am referring to is not limited to a soldier or a police officer or person engaged in self-defense. So I cannot think of any other word to describe the subject. I am not referring to an operator in a sense of some Tier 1 Special Forces soldier of sort. It is more in a sense of a telephone operator. Another term I will be using in the future is Emergence Potential Zone, or EPZ. This means an area where something of tactical significance may emerge. For example, a doorway where an opponent can appear is an EPZ. So let's examine what other factors are in tactics. We already examined objective. Let's start with a simple scenario as an example: Operation Personal Security. The objective is your own security against common street criminals. If you have nothing else to consider, then you can say you will live in a castle, travel in an armored personnel carrier, and simply blow away any threat you perceive with a cannon. This would make you nearly impossible to be a victim to a common street criminal. However, obviously this is not feasible for most people. First of all, you would not have enough money to afford a castle, armored personnel carrier, or a cannon. Second, you would have severe difficulty getting an armored personnel carrier or a cannon legally. Third, even if you did get those legally, it would be illegal to shoot anyone with a cannon only because you subjectively felt a vague threat that a reasonable person would not consider as a threat of serious injury or death. So this adds a number of factors to tactics. Whatever you do, you need to have the resource to do it, and you need to do it legally. In free states and United States, realistically, this would mean an average person's defense plan against common street thugs would be limited to small arms such as rifles or pistols. Now that we have an idea that most serious threat would generally involve gunfights, it now involves consideration of how to most effectively employ guns and how to defend against guns. So now the consideration involves concealment, protective cover, meaning what can shield yourself from gunfire, how to use those concealment and cover, and how to maneuver for use of cover and concealment. Also, since humans are the actors of this operation, human capability and limitation becomes a tactical factor. How well an operant can detect an opponent by vision, hearing, etc. Mental processing power involving how fast an operant can recognize entities of tactical significance in a situation, then make a situation assessment becomes a factor. For example, let's assume an operant rushed into a room of unknown situation. If it takes 2 seconds for that operant to recognize everything of tactical significance in the room, make a situation assessment, and determine who to shoot and whether if shooting is justified or not, but it takes only 1 second for an opponent in that room to shoot anyone that comes in, that operant dies. This also depends on operant's shooting skill, tactical aptitude. The opponent's skill level is also a factor, however, in most situations this would be an unknown to the operant. This is the primary reason behind segmented examination limited exposure method. I might refer to this as SELM later, however, this method is mostly known as slicing the pie. It is not my intention to fabricate a new term for every existing concept, however, the reason for the new term is because segmented examination limited exposure method has a broader definition than slicing the pie. It is to limit the amount of information human mind has to process and limiting exposure while doing so. This will require a separate episode for a full examination that goes beyond the scope of this episode. Another critical factor is the environment in which the operation takes place. Is the place an urban area? Is it inside a building? Does it involve shooting in or around a vehicle? Is it a wilderness? What terrain factors are involved? What structures, obstacles, or other feature of tactical significance exist? What is the weather? Would you freeze to death if the fight lasts for hours? So there are multiple factors that need to be considered even for a very simplistic operation of personal security. To describe more details, environmental protection gear such as cold weather clothing becomes a consideration. If that operation becomes longer, complex, involves travel, involves wilderness, or involve more operants, then more considerations involving logistics such as food, water, shelter becomes more significant. However, even these multitude of factors are straightforward in a relative sense if there is only one single and clear objective. A critical difficulty in tactics that must be processed is conflict of objectives. Except for self-defense operations of an ordinary citizen, in actual operations there is rarely just a single objective. There are usually two at a minimum. Let's change the scenario from individual self-defense to police searching a building to seize evidence or arrest a criminal. Now there are two objectives. One is officer safety, and the other is seizure of evidence or arrest of a criminal. If officer safety is the only objective, the course of action is simple: just never do any search at all. However, that would negate the purpose of why police exists, so it would not be a feasible option. Police officers would have to search for a criminal or evidence at some point. This is where the most serious difficulty starts. The objective of police officers' own safety and the objective of seizing evidence or having to confront a criminal for an arrest have a conflict. So now a question of how much risk the officer should take to seize evidence or confront a criminal becomes a factor. This becomes even more difficult of a question if the objective is to rescue another person, which is generally considered to be more important than seizing evidence or arresting a common criminal. At this point, we need to understand the difference between the concept of incidental risk and duty. So many people fail to understand the difference between the two. For example, a firefighter has an incidental risk of being burned to death. However, it would be absurd to say getting burned to death is a firefighter's duty. A lifeguard at a beach has an incidental risk of drowning to death. However, that does not mean a lifeguard has a duty to drown to death. A police officer's job has an incidental risk of serious injury or death, which the officers accept to some extent. However, that does not mean getting injured or killed is a duty. Under principle of liberty, there is no inherent obligation for a person to risk death or serious injury for another. Unless specified otherwise, the tactics I present assumes that an operand is considered not expendable for any objective. The conversation of this subject would be difficult and even unpleasant to many. However, tactics become dangerous without this conversation. Tactics cannot be established without a clear idea of what degree of risk operands decided to take for its objective and what objectives have priority. Ultimately, the final decision on how much risk an operand takes for an objective is decided in the operation by individual operands. It is not something that can be forced by a high-ranking official sitting behind a desk by writing policies. The situation may be different for special forces or SWAT units, as handling that high risk is the reason why those units exist. And that expectancy would be made clear to its members during high-risk scenario training they constantly repeat. And they are given the skill set to support that doctrine. In my opinion, giving average police officers 1 or 2 days of pretend to be Navy SEAL or Delta training, then expecting them to act like Special Forces soldiers is not a sound idea. That idea comes from a mistaken belief that most critical difference between an average cop and a Special Forces soldier is training. The actual most critical difference between an average cop and a Special Forces soldier is mentality. 1 or 2 days of oversimplified training is not going to make average people suddenly willing to take a bullet for someone else when that is not what those people had in mind when those people applied for the job. That is what makes people like Navy SEAL or Delta soldiers rare. Perhaps any able-bodied adult can be given a tactical aspect of Special Forces training, however, that does not magically transform them to a selfless warrior. Then Tier 1 blah blah whatever dynamic entry training or what have you those people may have received is useless. The reality of the matter is that Special Forces applicants and average police applicants are simply not the same type of people. Tactics that ignores how much risk the operants are willing to take has a risk of catastrophic failure. Tactics should be designed around operants' actual behavior, not based on ideals. Tactics is science. As far as science is concerned, your subjective sentiment about what anyone other than yourself should do or ought to do is irrelevant. It is about reality of what people actually do. That applies to everyone, including opponents and any other parties involved. So, I covered foundational factors involved in tactics. I present a list of factors involved in tactics. This is an ongoing project and not all-inclusive. This mostly consists of items on a list, so I will go through them quickly. The main factors are objectives and conditions. Objective meaning what is intended to be achieved. Conditions meaning under what condition that effort is made. It involves actors, resources, and constraints. Elements include rules, human element, logistics, parties present, and environment, and also assets. Rules include elements such as legal and organizational policy. Human element deals with capabilities, limitations, and needs of human actors. Logistics deals with various material and support needs. It deals with weapons, ammunition, and other equipments, food, water, hygiene products, and even toilet needs. Parties present. The obvious elements are operants and opponents. However, there are other elements such as cooperative party, unknown party, or hostile non-opponent party, or uninvolved party. A common training problem is a false dichotomy approach of only presenting opponents and innocent category in a training scenario. That does not prepare trainees for reality where parties present may not neatly fall into a category of either opponent or innocent. Each element would have sub-elements. For example, operants and opponents would have tactical skill, shooting skill, psychological characteristics, number, weapons, and equipment as a sub-element. Environment includes elements such as light conditions and visibility, weather, time, terrain, structure, protective cover or visual concealment, obstacles, and maneuver path. Assets. This can also involve weapons, ammunition, and other equipment. Also, control, communication, and intelligence infrastructure. The difference is that this is more in terms of what you can use for facilitation rather than what you need for maintenance. So this also includes means of reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, facilitation or support provided by outside party. Tactics involve operants as actors to form a plan of action, utilizing resources available in existing condition and considering other situational conditions to maximize the probability of achieving the objectives. This will be within the constraints the conditions impose. Tactics is an analytical process and it is a continuously ongoing process during the duration of the operation or even extending beyond it. Situation assessment and a course of action decision may constantly or fluidly change. So tactics is principle-based, not based on predetermined action scripts. This is a point that is often forgotten by many. There are some major common problems I see in relation to this matter. Some trainers fail to see or fail to properly communicate that tactics is a continuously ongoing process. Because it is a continuously ongoing process, there should be no total commitment to a certain action plan. However, some organizations have an attitude of being committed when an operation begins. That sometimes have catastrophic results when members find out that pre-scripted plans simply cannot work and they are mentally unprepared for altering or abandoning the plan. At times, aborting the plan or giving up the objective is needed. However, I do not recall seeing any organization that regularly includes total abandonment of operation plan as part of training. Trainees need to be taught to critically think about at what point they try something else. Some organizations even imply never retreat mindset. Such mindset has a potential for catastrophic consequences. This is seen in cases where police officers engaged in a confrontation that is going in a very wrong way or was improperly started and did not disengage only because of the never retreat mindset. Another problem is an attempt to substitute analytical process of a situation with a scripted procedure. Scripted procedure may be reasonable in situations where there is insufficient information or time for an analytical approach and some action needs to be taken immediately. However, there are cases of scripted procedure taking priority over analytical approach when there is no justification for it. This often involves bureaucrats of high rank who want to coerce standardization for standardization's sake. And these type of people are constantly in search for a standard operation procedure for everything which cannot exist in reality. There is no such thing as a standard uniform tactical situation. Standard operation procedures are not tactics. SOP is not a substitute for tactics. And when there is a conflict between SOP and tactics, tactics should supersede any operation procedures. This should be the policy. Another common problem is high-ranking staff or training department staff in organizations creating tactics or procedures based on scenario that exists in their imagination which conflicts with reality. This is a problem that I will call screenwriter tactics. Any dysfunctional idiotic tactics can be made to work in an imaginary scenario of a person who is the screenwriter, director, and choreographer of what opponents would or would not do. An example of the screenwriter tactics is scenario training, where trainees are successful only because the simulated opponents act within unrealistic constraints set by the training staff. You can see this in some training videos where force-on-force opponents are doing things like standing in the open in mostly featureless room, being an easy target, obvious to identify, while apparently not making serious effort to shoot the trainees. This is also seen in some police tactics that makes false assumptions about what a criminal would or would not do. This covered the concept aspects of tactics. Starting from next episode, I intend to cover application aspects. This is all I have for this episode. See you on the next one.